Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. By the end of 2018, UNESCO reported that 258 million children around the world were out of school. Just to understand what those numbers mean, roughly 1 in 5 school-age children are not in school at all. Now, with the UN and its partners setting 2030 as the deadline for quality education for all, on today's show, we discuss how this goal can in fact be realized and what needs to be done in order to make education more accessible and inclusive for all. To talk about this, we are joined by Dr. Cheema, who's running Alight Pakistan, a project working to ensure enrollment and retention of 1 million children across the country. He joins us in the Lahore studios. Also joining us is Dr. Ogudoro, who's the project director of the Nigerian Education Enhancement Project, and Mariam, who's a journalist and activist, joining us from Kabul. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this show. Dr. Cheema, let me begin with you. Now, we're stating this figure, 258 million children out of school. It's a multi-layered issue, why so many children are out of school. But how can one begin to understand the massiveness of the problem and where it truly begins?
Well, let's recognize that every country and every region has their own unique challenges. And there could be few uniform issues that would run across the globe. And I think major thing we see is the governance. The ability of a country to timely recognize the problem and be able to look for the solutions that are more effective and not keep on repeating the same old mistakes if there are any. So I would say governance is the major challenge that we see almost in every country where the education is a big challenge too.
Right. And Dr. Cheema, you mentioned the fact that each specific context is important to keep in mind. And that's where I'm going to direct my next question to you, Ms. Mariam. When we're talking about Kabul, about Afghanistan, now it being a conflict-stricken region, how are the difficulties and challenges there multiplied, exacerbated by the conflict itself, especially when we're talking about the educational sector?
Well, in regards to the context of Afghanistan, I think violence has become the norm. So I don't think that's going to be taking such a major factor as much as the cultural factor does. In Afghanistan, even now, at least a large percentage of girls stop attending schools after they hit puberty. Access to education is available. There's a large number, but the quality of the education is what's in question. In the past 18 to 19 years, we've had a lot of superficial progress versus actually the quality and content. In Kabul, because it is a mostly largely foreign influenced province because of all the diplomatic missions that we have present there, so you have relatively a higher quality. But when you spread out to the provinces, the attendance of the, especially girls, are lower, and quality is at a much lower standard than it would be from the urban cities.
Right.
Ms.
Wardak, sorry to interrupt you there, but a lot of superficial measures have been taken to increase the numbers. What do you mean by that exactly?
I think superficial measures that we have extremely nice buildings, but we don't have books or desks in the buildings. We have nice windows or we have nice boards, but we don't have qualified teachers. So superficial in the sense that it may look nice in photos when somebody's trying to create publicity buzz about it, but when you actually look at the quality of education, it's not there. You don't have any type of tutoring available if there's additional assistance needed. We have a large number of children who are mentally disabled or physically disabled. We don't have any access to those children or any assistance for those children. There needs to be, especially a country that is current war, we're still in war, there's a lot of assistance that needs to be there to provide that kind of support for the young population, but there is none. Aside from this, the kind of teachings that we have, it's very Soviet style, where it's memorization versus actually creativeness and elaboration and understanding of what you are learning and being able to recite it without memorization and actually trying to have a conclusion of your own mind. So I think that the quality is also into question. The influence that we have in our curriculum is also very it's influenced through multiple stakeholders. So you have the religious stakeholders, and you have the cultural stakeholders, and then you have the foreign influencers who are providing the funding for such education systems.
Right. Ms. Wardak, now the United Nations, of course, has aimed to provide all children across the world equality education by 2030. And it almost seems like this ambition is borderless. But you mentioned how there is a lack of assistance. What do you think is the reason behind that? Do you feel like politics intervenes when we're talking about funding specifically for education?
I think that in Afghanistan specifically, it's not constituent. It's not focused on the students and the needs of the students. It's run by donor vision. So when you have donors wanting to create some sort of number of schools, or trying to create a public event that we're going to reach this number, they will create an image of such sort. But when you actually do a follow-through, which there hasn't been done, and I think that this is what the United Nations really needs to do, is to go assess all of the programs that they have done, especially in Afghanistan, if it's a failure or if it's a success. Right. I don't think politics, of course, plays a role. In Afghanistan, it's more so corruption that plays a role. The United Nations gives a certain amount of funds to a ministry sector. Just a few days ago, the head of the Civil Service Commission, Mr. Nadari, accused the Ministry of Education of Afghanistan and its teachers of the high number of corruption that takes place. So you are robbing, again, the children of their future.
Right. That's a very essential point that you hear, a number of them. But one of them that I want to pick up on is the donor roles. And I want to take this question to Dr. Peter Ogudoro. Dr. Ogudoro, now, donor roles, and as Ms. Mariam Wardak stated, they're not always beneficial. In fact, they're often conflated with a publicity stunt or trying to create a public image. Do you feel like you could echo what Ms. Wardak just said here?
Talking specifically about my experience as somebody who has practiced education in Nigeria for up to 3 decades, what I do know is that the problem we are discussing is has a multidimensional root in terms of why we are where we are. Failure of the political system in Nigeria is largely responsible for what we're experiencing. And so you also have poverty at the root of our problems. And then the social system is such that a lot of children and their parents are at its advantage. They are not able to find access to good quality education, even when the people who run the political system do a lot of propaganda, giving impression that they are investing in education. We do know, however, that over the past 40 years, we have never had a year when Nigeria invested up to 10% of its national budget in education. Whereas we know that for a country at this level of development, we should be doing a minimum of about 15 to 20% if we're going to get all our children into the education system and provide them the infrastructure and the quality teachers who can make it easy for them to benefit from the education system. None of those things are in place. The quality of teachers here is nothing to write home about. In most of the schools, like especially in those in rural communities, and then the infrastructure is decrepit. It's not something that we can actually wonder what to hear about. And so overall, our political system is set up to benefit a narrow elite who train their children in the Western world, in America, Canada, and Britain. And so they are not able to see the incentive to fund the education system in Nigeria that can benefit the wider majority.
Right. Ms. Wardak, just a last question to you. Now, you mentioned corruption as being one of the most prominent causes for why we're seeing such a deterioration or the lack of investment in the educational sector. Do you feel like there can be any measures taken which can increase the transparency?
Well, I think there's multiple measures that need to be taken. I think that the international community needs to start holding governments more accountable. I think that aside from that, the partners that they work with on the ground, there's a lot of organizations that just started to grow because they found that there's going to be money, and it wasn't mainly a mission that they wanted to elevate the quality of education for Afghanistan. It was more so that they saw it as an opportunity to make money. One of the just recently, if I may mention, UN Women Afghanistan has been holding all these publicity events, and kind of giving a misconception on how certain cultural events take place in Afghanistan, and I have publicly criticized them about this. You can't take a Western perspective and come into your host country and change the way certain culture practices are taken. What you should do is come and complement the system that is already there and how to best elevate it, because that's going to be the best way that you'll move forward. So I think that organizations such as the UN need to be very observant and reflect on what the practices of the country, host country is, and then also to apply certain mechanisms within the region and then outside the region, rather than bringing something that's completely Western and applying it into such a traditional society. One. Second, partners that they're working for. Partners like Afghan Women Network that are really looking to advance women, women as mothers for their children. These organizations have been highlighted in mainstream media for being corrupt or misusing their funds. Why are such organizations still working with them? Or when you look at organizations within Afghanistan, many of them are run by Afghan foreigners, people that have returned from another country. So, of course, then you have to kind of really reflect on what their mission is. Did they just return here to make some sort of financial benefits for themselves, or is this the best interest for the country? Because somebody that was born and raised in Afghanistan and has lived through the struggles will understand what is needed versus for an Afghan that's come from abroad.
Right. Those points are some that are very thought-provoking, and we're going to take our discussion forward using those points that you brought up, Ms. Mariam Wardak. But thank you so much for joining us. That was Ms. Mariam Wardak from Kabul. Dr. Cheema, now, as Ms. Wardak stated, there are a number of issues that come with funding. And we are seeing a funding gap globally when we talk about education. But how can a country decide what is best for them, especially when we're talking about donor money and Western organizations funding local educational systems?
Well, let me begin that it was fascinating to what Mariam said. We need to be outspoken and we need to be honest. As long as our social interventions are going to be grant-driven or money-driven and not per se the human-centered, we will continue facing this problem. There are always an opportunity, which is a financial opportunity that is absolutely have no link with the social impact it yields or it generates. So I think the issue goes down below to the ethical norms and then coming to a governance which is more effective and accountable. So why I always focus on that is because no matter it is education or health or any basic services, until and unless our solutions are homegrown, the people who are involved has the indigenous actors, and our interventions are low cost, because low cost will eliminate the factor for those people who want to come and make money out of the human misery, and making it a low cost, high impact interventions. But they have to be human centered, and they should be linked with what I would call as radical accountability. Until and unless you are going to have these ingredients together, there will always be challenge of corruption, the low impact and exploitation of the human misery. And we see this pretty much around the globe. And the last thing I would say that UN can set an aim. United Nations sets the aim. United Nations do not take you to that place. This is upon the nations to see how they can achieve the goals which best suit to their own realities. They are synced with their own cultures. And to do so, I think we had an amazing experience in Pakistan that we later can discuss how perhaps the other people in the world can take advantage of that.
Right, and we definitely will get to the experience you've had working in Pakistan and trying to implement this very ambitious plan. But before that, I noticed that in your response, you mentioned cultural sensitivity multiple times. And you specifically mentioned trying to find homegrown solutions, trying to bring in indigenous people into the conversation. How can that be done effectively?
I think perhaps the first step in that direction would be to have a platform where local actors can exchange information. So if you see the country like Pakistan, and I'm sure many others like that, there is a tendency to work in isolations. People like to work in silos, they have a little bit of proprietorship issues, whereas if they start exchanging notes, if they start collaborating on the ground, obviously they do have some effective solution that can be replicated, adopted by others. And especially if they can even get together, they can collectively become big enough to be competitive with the international actors. Like Mariam mentioned, the Afghan Women Network. Afghan Women Network, if they are more robust, if they are more well-networked, well-positioned, obviously then they will have a more chance of competing and not only getting their share in the grant, but making sure, because their boots are on the ground, to deliver effectively and yield the impact.
Right. Dr. Peter Ogudoro, now, as we were talking to Dr. Cheema, he mentioned homegrown solutions, but he also mentioned trying to keep the costs low. Now, in Nigeria, primary schooling is almost free, and yet there are many children out of school. How do we make sense out of this?
Well, I did mention earlier that there are some socio-cultural factors combined with economic factors that are the root of Nigeria's peculiar challenge. In Nigeria, we must also realize that the entire Nigeria is not all the same. We have southern Nigeria, we have northern Nigeria. The problem of children who are out of school is more endemic in northern Nigeria, where culture is fueled essentially by the religious practice of the people, makes it difficult for them to stay, for them to be sedentary, stay in one place and get access to good quality education. And unfortunately, poverty has compounded the problem in northern Nigeria, where most parents don't have money to put their children, and so children have become laborers who are the ones who, because their parents don't have jobs, now go out to sell, hawking things in the street, and so they don't have time to be in the classroom. So even when you make education free, the children are hungry and they are the breadwinners of their homes. They certainly will not be able to stay in classroom and receive the quality education you're providing them. More importantly, the education that we're providing children in Nigeria, especially from the government sector, is not good quality education. They sit down in the classroom, but learning is not taking place in most of the places. And so what you find is that parents who don't have money to put their children in the private sector of the education system are not able to get good quality education. So the incentive for them to remain there doesn't exist. And because of poverty, the cost of accessing private education is very high and beyond the reach of over 50% of the Nigerian population. And so this problem will remain so long as poverty remains at the root of the matter. As we speak now, about 70% of the Nigerian population have difficulty putting food on the table. Where their dinner will come from this evening is something they are not sure. So all of these factors are working together to make it difficult for children to be in school, even when government says education is free.
Right. Now, Ogudoro, you mentioned here that learning doesn't take place in the classroom. So even when students are there, they're really not taking in the information. It's not taking them where they need to be. How do you think that can be improved? We hear a lot about the role that technology can play now, how innovative measures can be taken in order to ensure that learning actually takes place in the classroom. Are there any homegrown experiences within Nigeria?
Well, we are trying to develop some homegrown alternatives to what the Western world have provided us over the years. But poor funding and lack of the right manpower are combining to make it difficult for us to make progress along these lines. As we speak now, the basic education level in Nigeria is short-staffed by close to 500,000 teachers. And so in the absence of good quality teachers, even if you are able to provide the technology, the teachers who have the skills are not there to operate them. And the children themselves, certainly, if the teachers don't know, you can imagine the level at which the children they're teaching, would be. And so until we're able to, as a political institution, commit enormous resources into providing the right infrastructure so that where teachers are not available, we can use, the right technology, modern technology to reach children even in their homes, which is something that I think we should experiment. Massive online courses are things that we can use at the moment to empower teachers who teach in these places if we don't have the money to bring them together to give them the skills. But the government of Nigeria seems to favor at the moment Western styled approaches to solving peculiar challenges of the country. And I think that until we get politicians to look at these matters from a new perspective and probably compare them to have their own children in the schools in Nigeria, we might not be able to make progress. Because I think a major problem at the root of Nigeria's circumstance is the fact that the elites who run even the school system at all levels don't have their children studying in that public school system. All their children are in America, in Britain, and in Canada, receiving good quality education. So the incentive for them to make things happen qualitatively in Nigeria is certainly not there.
Right. On that, thank you so much, Dr. Peter Ogudoro, for joining us from Nigeria. On that point, we're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue with our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we talk about how education can become more accessible and inclusive for children all across the world. Joining us for this discussion is Dr. Tariq Cheema, running a Light Pakistan project working to ensure enrollment and retention of 1 million children across the country. He's in the Lahore studios with us. Also joining us now is Ms. Zainab Qureshi, who's the Learning and Educational Achievement in Pakistan School Senior Program Manager at Evidence for Policy Design. She oversees the implementation of the Research on Improving Systems of Education program within Pakistan, and Dr. Rashawn Ray, who's a sociologist and Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Ray, let me begin with you. Now, we've been talking about education and how to make it more inclusive. So far, we've been talking about how to get children within school, but we do know there are many factors at play which marginalize children within the schooling system. Could you take us through those factors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a lot of issues within schools. I mean, obviously, when we talk across the world, I mean, we're dealing with really an epidemic of large proportions where over 600 million children actually aren't proficient, and over 250 million children are actually out of school. I think within schools, we see a lot of disparities. I mean, I think economic resources, the amount of money that goes to schools make a big difference. I mean, we're talking about basic needs, running water. We're talking about enough books. We're talking about efficient bathrooms. We're talking about heating and air conditioning, depending on where people are around the world. I think particularly air conditioning. Research shows that students who learn in warmer classrooms actually perform poorer. That shouldn't be surprising to people, considering what it actually does to our bodies when we are put in extreme temperatures. And so I think part of looking at this is that this is a global epidemic, something that the United Nations, for example, is really trying to push. And I think when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at Western and Central Asia, we're seeing this in biblical proportions in ways that we need to really focus on and stress what's happening, not just across countries, but also within countries and the disparities that we see within schools.
Right. Zainab, now, Dr. Ray mentioned something which was a startling fact, that 600 million children across the world fail to be proficient. How do we measure this proficiency?
Meshal, measuring proficiency is a hard challenge, right? And what we've been using to measure essentially all forms of learning outcome for the last while has been test scores as a proxy for learning measures. And the problem with using test scores is that they are restrictive and they limit what you are measuring and how much it can actually tell you about a child. But I was on a show with you earlier and we talked about 21st century skills, which are the skills that kids require, that kids need to actually succeed in this world in the 21st century. And the fact of the matter is that it's been very hard for us to measure those. You can measure proficiency in reading, you can measure proficiency in writing, you can measure proficiency in numeracy and basic math. But it's really hard to measure things like perseverance or determination or grit or creativity. And I think those are the key skills that kids will need going forward, and those are very hard to measure. That said, there is a lot of work being done on that, and there are a lot of people working on that. There is research happening right now to see how we can sort of measure those more effectively.
Right, it's still work in progress. It's a complicated job. I understand that. Dr. Cheema, now you are heading one of the most ambitious plans within Pakistan, which is trying to get 1 million children within schools. Now, we have been talking about learning as well. How does this goal also try to make sure that there's actual learning within these schools?
Well, I think first of all, you cannot really separate learning from the education. That is what the purpose is. Enrollment or retention is just a measure to make sure the kids learn. Obviously, the problem in many countries, and in Pakistan as well, is very complex, where those who are the education providers also have the quality issue. You know, the teachers and their lack of capacity to provide education, and then some other issues that comes with whether they are present, and all this discussion, how effectively they are making the kids learn. So I think it's a complex issue. But as you asked, I mean, we just cannot think of any intervention that has to do with children, that has to do with education, should not be considered valid until it yields learning.
Right.
And so I think when it comes to the Pakistan context, we see it's a big challenge. 22 million out-of-school children. We are hosting the second largest population of out-of-school children in the world. They make 10% of our population. They make almost 1/3 of our youth, which is the larger segment, and the country relying upon that. So the opportunity loss and the economic burden, all of those things make it even more important that the quality aspect has to be looked into. And while a bit earlier when we were talking about the homegrown solution, that does not mean that no intervention that has a foreign origin is not effective. The whole issue is how to make it, how to tailor it according to our needs and our realities so that the learning is improved. So when we look at the international level, like what Ray and Zainab has mentioned, I mean, there is a robust dialogue undergoing about how to enhance the quality. You know, what are the challenges, why so many kids are out of the school. But when you look at the national levels, that dialogue is missing. That debate is missing. Either we are talking about numbers, how many kids we can put into the school, or there are also work is being done on learning and the quality of education also in a very specific and well-defined silos. So I think where we can really make sure that the quantity and the quality is the one same thing, while it is the responsibility of the state to provide education to every child, it is also important that they are coming out of the school with some learning. And I think in Pakistan, poor quality of education is one of the major factors why kids are out of school. I have been almost into 55 districts, which makes half of the country, and where we have our people and we get the feedback on daily basis. The issue is, they said, where is the value proposition to send our child to school? Yes, there is a school, there's a teacher, but what is going to learn? And I think I have yet to come across to a single parent who would say, I don't want education for my son or a daughter.
Right.
So I think education without quality is really an exercise that is futile.
Right. Dr. Tariq Cheema, let me ask you this. What policy measures have you seen working?
Well, there is no one, magic pill here. The issue is various sectors have to work together. I mean, our experience by rolling out the 1 million out-of-school children program is country's largest ever out-of-school children intervention. And let me tell you that it has not started simply because that we had the sufficient funding. This program actually, $1 as a cash grant is mobilizing at least $5 as a match grant domestically. So if you look at a program which, let's say, is the size of $100 million, we are almost getting 80% of that money coming from the same country. So countries some like Pakistan are not resource poor. I think they are poor in the way they govern themselves. So I think what we have learned which works is that you have to be looking into system reforms. You cannot simply say, the same old system that has been consistently failed will bring some results. So what do we teach? How do we teach? Who can teach? All of those issues are very important, especially at the primary level. The second thing is, which is already, I think you mentioned, or one of our fellow panelists talks about technology. I mean, where are those innovations that can enhance the access? How can we leverage technology in a country where connectivity is really well, where millions of people now have the smartphones? So I think those are the areas one has to look into it. While you are co-creating or co-developing any intervention, I must say we must take governments on board.
Right.
There are so many resources are available. Maybe they are not efficient enough, but those can be monetized, those can be leveraged to reach out to the maximum children with the less cost. The last thing that I always talk about, that collaboration are very important. There is absolutely no reason for my organization to say, oh, we are the sole players and we know how to do this job. No. Every day we run into problems. And I think without collaborating with other people, be their citizens, community members, government officials, nonprofits, you have to work together, and you have to build a momentum.
It's a community effort trying to deal with the situation at hand. I take your point there. Dr. Ray, just jumping to you. Now, we've been talking about learning. I've put this question to Zainab, Dr. Cheema as well, but I want a different perspective from you. Now, in areas and regions and countries where there are various ethnicities, various classes, a very, very diverse community, do you feel like learning is not brought up to the optimal level if the curriculum itself is not relatable to the children?
Yes. So the point about education and learning, it was an excellent point. I mean, part of what's happening when we talk about ethnicity, for example, within any country, is that minority groups and marginalized groups are oftentimes left behind when it comes to education. And left behind means that their schools are given less resources. If they are in rural areas, they are giving less access to technology. And we have to be very clear that around the world, not only is this about ethnicity and, say, national origin or being part of a marginalized group, but it also has a lot to do with gender, that girls are really left behind in certain countries that really embrace patriarchal societies. And so part of what we have to, and then there's another important point which deals with conflict, that areas that have been conflict ridden, rural areas, and then you talk about girls and as they come of age, those are the groups to really focus on. And the disparities within countries, when we see well-resourced areas, oftentimes in urban areas, oftentimes in more affluent areas, are drastically different from lower income marginalized places. And those marginalized places tend to be places where we see more ethnic groups situated. And I mean, they are simply being left behind. I mean, in this global market, it's really about the haves and the have-nots. Schools are teaching the test scores, as we heard earlier, and they're not really getting back to vocational and technical training that's really going to prepare people for a 21st century workforce.
Right. Zainab, that's a very interesting point that Dr. Ray brought up, which is how important technical training and vocational training is in this entire process. You being an expert who's been researching on innovative methods, how much value do you feel like technical life skills or technical training adds to the entire schooling system?
So, Meshal, technical and vocational training is very important, especially in a country like Pakistan, right? And in a lot of sort of developing countries and in a lot of industrialized countries. So if you look at countries that have done it really well, let's say a bunch of European countries, Germany, for instance, a whole bunch of European, Scandinavian countries do technical and vocational training, except that happens after some basic schooling has done, right? So it happens after basic secondary schooling. And so I think it's really difficult to expect schools to integrate technical training into their programs. But I think what would work really well is if schools had links to be able to link children up to technical and vocational centers after they're done once, let's say with 8th grade, for instance. A lot of countries also have different paths available for students. So even within secondary school, students can decide whether they want to go on to more of an academic track or more of a technical track. And then they can take those routes and go further in. So that's something that could work potentially very well for developing countries like Pakistan also.
Right. Dr. Ray, as we're talking about how to make school systems more effective, one thing that I do want to ask you about is when there is a disparity amongst different schools in terms of the quality of education, how does that impact later on development? How does that reproduce inequalities?
Yeah, well, disparities within schools, completely replicate inequalities throughout life. Work profiles, the ability for people to obtain wealth, the ability then for people to go on to higher levels of learning and education, to a university. We are talking about huge disparities. So, if we just, for example, give the United States as an example, people don't necessarily consider the United States to have these problems, but they have these massive problems. And part of it has to do with the way that schools are funded. That it used to be that the federal government really supplied a large part of the education system. And the United States has always heralded itself as having an equal school system. That could not be farther from the truth. Everyone knows that that's a fallacy. And instead what's happening is that state funding is really driving school funding. Local property taxes is what's determining how much money schools get. So if you live in an impoverished area, and then this model has been replicated throughout the world. So if you live in an impoverished area, in a place where the housing is really inexpensive, where poverty is really high, then that means you're going to also have a poor school. And the unfortunate part of that is that you have children who are being born who are told that they're going to get access to a quality education, oftentimes a free education, oftentimes an equitable education. And that could be farther from the truth, whether you're in the United States, Pakistan, or other parts of the world.
Right. On that, thank you so much, Professor Rashawn Ray, for joining us and talking to us about this. Of course, it is important to take different school systems with a critical lens, evaluating them before replicating them throughout the world. Dr. Cheema, now, something that Zainab mentioned, and I feel like it's worth going back to, she mentioned how vocational training is important, but it can only happen after a basic level of education is achieved. Now, that also brings to light the question of retaining students up till the point where they can actually go and develop further skills. How do you feel like that can be improved, the retention of students?
In the Pakistan context, I think that three things are key, how we can not only address the challenge of out-of-school children, but provide them the life skills so that they can make their earning in a dignified way. One is the accelerated learning program, because if you look at what we mean by out-of-school children, we actually have more kids which are between age 9 to 16 versus below 9 years age. So which means we have this big number of the youth which will be actually as age 14, 15, and 16 who could have ideally passed the primary education and middle grade education. So if they are going in a regular education pathway and they finish the 5th grade, and I think she's absolutely right that 8th grade is where they already have enough level of literacy and knowledge, and then you provide them a skill training, and then they go out and become people who can be productive.
Right.
But then we are also dealing in our program with the kids as big as 14, 15, and 16. So what we like to do is to create a simultaneous model where you give them the literacy, numeracy, knowledge, but at the same time you provide them a skill. So in our case, this is an approach what a doctor will take in emergency room versus a doctor who will take approach in his routine,
Right.
walk-in clinic. So accelerated learning programs, so we can give them a quick knowledge, bring them to the level of the primary education maybe in a couple of years, and simultaneously make it an integrated education model where some level of the skills that comes with it. And the third thing, which is most important in today's time, is, as I think it is already mentioned, how to embrace and adopt the innovative alternatives and approaches. And if they are technology enabled, they're definitely are more affordable.
Right. Zainab, just to quickly get to you before we wrap up the show. Now, we talk about quality, and that's been something we've been discussing throughout here. What measures do you feel like can be adopted, especially by governments in developing countries, to ensure that there is a regulated quality of sorts among schools all over?
Meshal, regulation is a very highly contested and controversial topic, right? I think I think the role of governments at this point needs to be able to set some sort of a minimum standard, because in a lot of places in the world there is the private sector especially is very highly regulated. In Pakistan, you have the opposite, where there's no regulation for the private sector. And every time regulation has come in, even with this whole recent episode of fee structures, etc., it's been at a very superficial level to try and sort of almost as to try and contain and to restrain private schools to not be able to do certain things. Where we haven't seen, where regulation I think would really help, or where government intervention would help, is to be able to create a more open environment where schools, all sorts of schools, public schools as well as private schools, can be nurtured and can innovate. Dr. Cheema just mentioned innovation. That is going to be key, right? Where school leaders who know their environments and know their problems much better than you and I do, can sort of help, can have access to resources and can have access to expertise that can help them solve those problems. Whether it's education technology or it's like, cutting edge research all over the world, there is an
it's a facilitation process
works.
that really matters. Okay, so I take your point there, Zainab, and that's a very essential point you stated. Thank you so much for drawing emphasis on that. And thank you so much, Zainab Qureshi, for joining us from Boston. Thank you, Dr. Tariq Cheema, for joining us in the studios. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.